Good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming, and welcome to another lecture in this year's series of London lectures on remembering and forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And since the theme is remembering and forgetting, I'm hoping that some of you are experiencing an agreeable twinge of nostalgia to be back in this hall where all the lectures took place last year. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening's speaker, Michael Brady. Michael is known especially for his work on the philosophy of emotion. He's professor at the University of Glasgow. He's written a number of books about emotion. One of them is called Emotion, the Basics. Another one's Emotional Insight. A third, very thought-provoking title, this, is The Value of Suffering. He's had major research grants from the Templeton Foundation and most recently from the Leverhulme Trust, on which he's working on the philosophy of post-traumatic growth, which I think informs the talk he's going to be giving this evening, which is on trauma, emotion, and memory. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I sometimes say that and don't mean it, but I really do mean it on this occasion. And thank you, Edward, for the kind words. It was a bit daunting to be invited to give a talk in this series. One, because of the prestige of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Secondly, because I don't really know much about memory or forgetting, or at least I didn't. And then I thought, well, I do know stuff about emotion, and I am writing a book on trauma, so maybe I can look at the relations between trauma, emotion, and memory. And then something else that's very daunting happened. There are connections all over the place. And you see so many connections and so much complexity here, just like how am I ever going to write a talk and present a talk on that? But hopefully I've narrowed it down a little bit. Just to give you an illustration of the kind of connections there are and the kind of complexity, think of the relations between trauma, emotion, and memory when it comes to questions of value. And in particular, when it comes to memorials. Memorials which remind us of trauma, and think of the different views we might have of the value or disvalue of these memorials. So a photograph of protesters throwing the statue of Edward Colston into Bristol Harbour. A reasonably famous photograph. I could have had protesters destroying statues of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, protesters destroying statues of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. These are memorials which are connected with collective and historical trauma. And you can see, I think, how they might be related to emotions, in particular, negative emotions. In this case, connections between emotions of disapprobation and disesteem, which this statue and other statues, perhaps like it, generated in the protesters. And also generated emotions of anger, disgust, contempt, shame, and other negative emotions. These would be reliably connected with statues and memorials like this. And also generating a behaviour like throwing a statue in the river, which might be destructive. Other people might think in another interpretation it's constructive behaviour, because we ought not to have memorials like that near Bristol Harbour. So you see already the connections between emotion, trauma, and value, and the fact that this is just one instance of a complex relationship of these memorials. Okay, so that's one relation we might have when it comes to collective trauma. However, there are other memorials which function to keep trauma in the collective consciousness, to keep us remembering trauma, and which are the marks of any well-functioning, moral and socially just society. So other reminders, memorials which remind us of trauma and play an important role in generating negative emotion and emotional distress are very much necessary, one might think. For instance, here's the Bologna Shoah Memorial, built to coincide with International Holocaust Remembrance Day in 2016, but you could have lots of other instances. A memorial museum at Auschwitz, the Armenian Genocide Museum, La Porte de Non-Retour in Benin, and so on, Hiroshima Peace Park, and so on and so forth. These are part of well-functioning moral and just societies, and they remind us of things which are deeply traumatic at the collective and historical levels. They are valuable morally and socially for that very reason. And they generate both negative emotions, horror, grief, guilt, feelings of incomprehension. We'll look at these later on. But also positive emotions, you might feel. Gratitude, solidarity, commitment to justice. And they play an educational role because of this, because of the relation between the negative emotions and the positive emotions that they generate. And therefore, they're valuable on all kinds of dimensions, you might think. and they motivate constructive behaviour, but in part because they generate the negative emotions. It's because they generate emotional distress that they play the educational roles that they do, one might think. Okay. Constructive behaviour, educational, activist behaviour, reconciliation, all kinds of things that we might regard as positive behaviour. So you see already complex relations between memory, trauma, emotion and value. That's at the kind of collective or social level, but it's also true at the individual level. This is a Stalneset Memorial in Norway that commemorated, I think, 91 women who were burnt as being accused of witches in the 17th century. A smaller scale memorial, but that's still at the collective level. But also there are complex relations and interesting relations between trauma, emotion and memory at the individual level. So we find a similarly complex story with trauma at the individual level. And in between there's lots of kind of grassroots memorials that are really interesting. The phenomenon of ghost bikes, which are placed by side of the roads where people have died in cycling accidents. That's a kind of grassroots memorial. And again, representing keeping in memory something traumatic that's happened. So similarly complex story with trauma at the individual level and relations between memory, emotion and trauma. This seems straightforwardly true. Trauma involves vehement emotion, and I'll talk about this in a while, which disrupts and fractures memory. Traumatic effects involve intrusive memories, and these are criterial for post-traumatic stress disorder. They're one of the things that define post-traumatic stress disorder, at least in the DSM definition of it. So trauma has severe negative effects on memory. It fractures and disrupts memory. Intrusive memories are criterial for post-traumatic stress disorder. However, many people, and I'm one of them, think that there's another relationship as well. Traumatic memories and emotional distress are vital for something called post-traumatic growth. Ways in which people benefit in significant ways after trauma and benefit, and I'm going to argue, because of the memories and the emotional distress that these memories generate. That's what I'm going to talk about today. You can hold the second whilst holding the first. You can hold the second and say some people experience growth or report experiencing growth in the aftermath of trauma, whilst acknowledging the true horrors of other collective and individual trauma. So this is not, hopefully, a talk that's engaged in bright-siding, saying there's always an upside to trauma, or trying to make light or look at silver linings. That's not what this talk is. It's to acknowledge the horror and the damage that trauma causes at the collective individual level, but also looking into the phenomenon studied for the last 40 years by psychologists and very rarely by philosophers of post-traumatic growth. And I want to look at the role of memory and emotion in post-traumatic growth. Okay, that's the setup. Okay so far? Good. Not going too fast. If I am, just put your hand up and tell me to slow down. So I want to focus on the role of memory and negative emotion in helping people grow after trauma. And I'm aware that there's loads of skepticism about PTG, and I will explain some of that as we go along. But in two ways, I think memories of trauma are central to meaning making. Meaning making is associated with post-traumatic growth. And I think memories of trauma are vital for generating social support. So that's another way in which you might think memories of trauma and the emotional distress that they generate are important for people to grow. And both meaning and social support are strongly associated with post-traumatic growth. So say the psychologists, so I want to argue in a book. So you might think that memories of trauma therefore enjoy a particular paradoxical status. On the one hand, they generate and maintain emotional distress, and we'll see the damage that intrusive memories and emotional distress can cause. And it's distress, so you might think that's automatically a bad thing. So the fact that memories of trauma generate emotional distress suggests that they have significant disvalue, but in so doing, because of the distress that they generate, they facilitate post-traumatic growth, which lots of people think is a good thing. So there's a kind of weird paradoxical status about memory, negative emotion, and growth after trauma. That's the particular aspect I want to convince you of. If not convinced, give some hand-waving arguments in the general direction of. Okay, so trauma and post-traumatic growth. For the next 5 minutes, I'm going to be really prescriptive in telling you what I think trauma is. There are, since 2014, 800,000 academic articles written on trauma, with the word trauma or concept trauma in. There's 100,000 on post-traumatic stress disorder. That's just the academy. There are Bessel van der Kolk, 2014 book, The Body Keeps the Score. It's been on the New York Times bestseller list in 2017, sold 2 million copies. Number 1 on the bestseller list in 2021, clearly related to COVID. I don't know about things like TikTok, but I'm reliably informed because I can do Google searches. So the hashtag trauma on TikTok 2 years ago, so in the original version, I used the figure 2 years ago, the hashtag trauma had 6.2 billion views on TikTok. That's 2022. 2024, it has 14.6 billion views on TikTok. Lots and lots of people are thinking about talking about trauma. So how do you come up with a theory of trauma? You have to be prescriptive. I have to say, okay, here's what I think it is, and hope that it does 2 things. One, it's descriptively apt. What I'm talking about when I talk about trauma kind of merges with what the psychologists and psychiatrists, who most of the people interested in post-traumatic growth, are talking about. So it has to be descriptively apt, but also I think it has to be normatively apt. Trauma's a bad thing, it's a terrible thing, and whatever account of trauma you give, it better capture the badness. It can't just be merely descriptive. It has to capture the badness of it. And I think trauma's a kind of emotional injury. I think that's descriptively apt. I think it fits how psychologists talk about trauma, but I also think the notion of injury is etymologically sound, but also it captures the true badness of what trauma is. I think something like that's needed, as I'll explain, in order to resist a certain kind of concept creep, where trauma refers to bad feelings in general, and I'm sure this is reasonably familiar, but I think that's the account I want to give. How to motivate that? Well, here is what the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, says about, not about trauma, but about post-traumatic stress disorder. So, a traumatic event, according to DSM-5, is an event which involves a person being exposed to actual threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. The exposure can take place in a number of ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing in person the event or events as it occurred or they occurred to others, and learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental. Okay, that's what DSM-5 says. That's controversial. Lots of people have thought that that's problematic in various ways. There's tons of discussion about it, but I think it's a decent starting point. There's loads of qualifications you might want to make at this point. One is, it looks as if trauma is an event from this, or an event that's experienced. And you might think they're necessary conditions, but they're certainly not sufficient conditions, because you might experience an event like this and yet not be traumatized at not being a traumatic event. Okay, so trauma isn't simply an event of a particular type. Here's why. You might experience traumatic events or things which fall under the definition as exciting. So the characters in J.G. Ballard's Crash, for instance, experience car crashes as sexually exciting. And it's an experience of a traumatic event, but it's not traumatic for them, given their interest in it. You might think if you follow tornadoes, if you watch the films Twister or Twister 2, people get excitement from following tornadoes. A traumatic event, a natural disaster, but it's not a traumatic experience, because although they're exposed to the event, they don't experience it in a particularly damaging way. So you can't just think trauma as an event, nor simply an experience of an event. It has to have some negative effect on the person. So it's something bad that happens to a person as a result of being exposed to a particular kind of event. I think it involves badness in at least 4 ways. It involves negative appraisals. So the person who's traumatized has to appraise or evaluate the event as bad, or as very bad, or as horrific. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a propositional attitude like belief or judgment, but in some sense, people are thinking of what happened as very bad. It involves negative feelings, extreme feelings. Pierre Janet, the psychologist in the late 19th century, said it involves vehement emotions, which is a great phrase, I think, of fear and horror. So that's what's, again, central to a traumatic experience. It's not just being exposed to an event, it's feeling fear and horror and terror as a result. Vehement emotions in Janet's terms. It involves a sense of losing control or helplessness. A way in which you're not sure what to believe, you're not sure how you can relate to other people, you're not sure what you can do, so you're helpless in the face of the traumatic event. So that seems to be part of what it is to have a traumatic experience and one of the elements of badness. And it has a whole range of negative effects, including These are the kinds of typical traumatic effects: hypervigilance, sleep disturbance, intrusive memories, feelings of shame and guilt, irritability, withdrawal, mental and behavioural avoidance. Those are the kind of paradigmatic effects of traumatic experiences. Okay. So here's what you might think, or here's what I think is happening. Vehement emotions, extreme emotions of terror, fear, horror, generate feelings of helplessness, and they generate a range of debilitating effects. These can be understood together, the feelings of helplessness and effects, as an emotional injury. That trauma is derived from the Greek, I'm not trying to pronounce that, which means injury or wound. Why is that not an implausible definition? It's much more plausible than thinking of negative feelings or vehement emotions themselves as trauma, which is what happens with a lot of the concept creep. People think, I'm feeling bad, therefore I'm traumatized. Now, I don't want to diminish at all feelings of suffering, ways in which people feel bad about all kinds of things, but I think there's useful conceptual distance between feeling bad and feeling genuine things like grief and being traumatized, because you might feel grief which is entirely appropriate and yet not be injured by it, precisely because it's entirely appropriate for you to feel grief in these circumstances. So again, and I don't want to dismiss people's feeling bad about these things, but you know, there will be stories, people saying they were traumatized by Brexit. In one sense, if you think, you know, Brexit was a bad thing that happened and people feel really bad about Brexit and therefore you have all kinds of negative feelings, but you might think, unless you've been injured by those feelings, and unless those feelings were genuine feelings of terror, horror, and extreme anxiety, then however bad you're feeling, you've not been traumatized. That's what this account says, and it allows you to resist a particular kind of concept creep, where trauma is expanded to cover lots of negative experiences. You want to resist that while still acknowledging the seriousness of the negative experiences, the bad feelings. Bad feelings are bad. It's the nature of the term. Nevertheless, you might want to resist calling them traumatic. You can on this kind of account of what trauma is. Anyway, that's my very prescriptive account of what trauma is. What's post-traumatic growth? It's a term that's been used to describe positive psychological changes that result from trauma and other highly stressful events. And it's been reported from a wide range of events, some of which really approximate the DSM definition, some of which don't quite approximate it, but are in the kind of vicinity, so you might speak. So that's a list of the events that people have studied and psychologists have studied and have reports of post-traumatic growth from these kinds of events and many other similar kinds of events. That's a quote from psychologists Linley and Joseph in 2004. And growth has been reported across three broad dimensions. Changes to self. So I'm sure you're familiar with Nietzsche's aphorism, what does not kill me makes me stronger. That's a kind of change it to self. You become stronger, you become more resilient. That's the kind of change that lots of people report. Changes to relationships. People talk about their relationships being stronger and deeper and better. They appreciate other people much more. This is, again, reports of growth. And changes to philosophy of life, which is in this talk. I mean, it's kind of a tricky one, but people talk about engaging in more spiritual or metaphysical thinking. They change their views of what's really important in life. Those are the three broad categories of change. How many people report post-traumatic growth on one or more dimension? Surprisingly high numbers, which is one of the reasons why psychologists are interested in it, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in it as a philosopher. So Joe Wickrimmer and Blackie note, researchers demonstrated that self-reports of post-traumatic growth are fairly common. 58 to 83% of survivors of a range of different traumas. That's really surprising, in my view. You go through such terrible events, the kind of events listed there, you have experience of them as traumatic. More than half of people report growth on one or more of these dimensions. That's interesting. That's why psychologists are really interested in investigating it. You might think that's a cause for hope. Lots of people think post-traumatic growth has various ethical and moral concerns in the vicinity, which I'll talk about in a little while. But anyway, that's the kind of reported figures. Okay. Here are some conceptual constraints on post-traumatic growth. If there is to be such a thing, it has to meet certain constraints to differentiate it from other things. One, this is a bit weird, but it's supposed to be real. supposed to be actual change, and not merely perceived change, not merely change that you report, not merely positive illusions. So it's supposed to be change that is actually has actually happened. Lots of people are skeptical about PTG because they're skeptical about ways of measuring actual change. Most of the reports are self-reports that happened maybe 2 or 3 years after trauma, and it might be really difficult to have reliable self-reports that length of time after trauma. All kinds of methodological worries, but nevertheless, that's what it's meant to be. It's meant to be actual change. It's different from resilience and recovery, and it's different from coping. Resilience is bouncing back to where you were pre-trauma. Coping is doing things to cope, as the name suggests, with the effects of trauma. So looking for silver linings would be a way of coping, or reappraising what happened, that might be a way of coping. That's not post-traumatic growth, and that's resilience and coping. It's significant and meaningful, and again, philosophical terms that are quite tricky. What do you mean by significant? What do you mean by meaningful? But at least you can capture that by saying, well, it ought not to be trivial. Whatever growth is, it better be related to things which are central to and important to your life. So it can't just be a trivial change, a minor change. Again, very hand-wavy way of capturing that kind of thing. It's positive, and again, that might seem itself trivial, but one of the worries with lots of ways of measuring post-traumatic growth is the criteria aren't non-controversially or uncontroversially positive. So some people think you grow if you become more religious or you engage in more spiritual thinking. Well, in some cultures, maybe a highly scientific or materialistic culture, that wouldn't be growth. You might think that's a way that someone diminishes if they're engaging in religious thinking, when, you know, in this culture they think that's not reflective of what true metaphysical reality is. So one interesting question is, what do you mean by positivity here? And it has to be kind of a plausibly positive change. And finally, and this is again, I think, an interesting philosophical question about post-traumatic growth, it's got to be a non-accidental result of trauma. I mean, originally when psychologists talked about post-traumatic growth, they said, well, it's positive psychological change that can result from trauma. That's a really weak claim. It's kind of almost so weak to be uninteresting. Because, you know, anything can bring about any positive change in the right circumstances. So merely talking about the possibility of trauma generating change is much too weak. But you'd better not go the other way and make really strong claims like all trauma brings about growth, because that's patently false. So what's the right kind of modal connection between trauma and growth here? And it has to be kind of non-accidental. You know, maybe I suffer chronic pain and I'm in a pain clinic and I fall in love with my future wife. In one sense, pain has made my life much better off. But it's the wrong kind of link, because it's an accidental link. It's a fortuitous link. So it's not the kind of thing that we would call post-traumatic growth. Okay, so those are conceptual constraints on post-traumatic. If there is to be such a thing, there better be something that meets all those constraints. For Lawrence Tedeschi and Richard Calhoun, they're two of the psychologists that have done the most work, I think, on post-traumatic growth. The best measurement tool is a post-traumatic growth inventory, a form of retrospective self-report developed in 1996, still the most popular way of measuring it. And they have 21 items on this, and they can be grouped into 5. So the 3 were pretty broad, but here are the 5 that they think they've got really good empirical evidence for. People consistently report growth in these dimensions. Appreciation of life. I appreciate life more after trauma. Personal strength. I'm stronger in various dimensions. New opportunities. Relating to others, and spiritual change. Okay, that's what the psychologists have said. Hopefully that's what trauma is, that's what post-traumatic growth is. What's the role of emotion and memory in this area? Well, here are some psychological perspectives, and here are the negative dimensions. One is that intrusive memories are a central and damaging effect of trauma. They often have a behavioural correlate, mental avoidance and physical avoidance. So you don't think about what happened, that's a mental avoidance, because memories are intrusive, and you therefore do what you can to avoid the intrusive memories, usually associated with ongoing emotional distress and the development of PTSD. So one of the really bad things about memory in relation to trauma is the intrusive nature of memory. So here's just a sample quote. There's tons of quotes like this you could find. Erin Clout, psychologist and colleagues. PTSD is the most extreme and enduring form of disturbance and is characterized by recurrent, involuntary and intrusive memories of the trauma, which are experienced as distressing. So tons of psychological evidence that one of the really big problems post-trauma is the intrusiveness of memory. And that's why lots of people think memory and intrusive memories after trauma are a bad thing, and therefore that's the overall picture we should have of evaluative picture we should have of memory. Here's another one from Rigolian and colleagues. It's been widely argued that PTSD is mainly a memory disorder, and intrusions are amongst its hallmark symptoms. Okay, that's the negative perspective from psychology. Well, here's some of the positive perspective, and here's to start to make a positive case or positive illustration of why memory emotional distress might positively relate to growth. Here's a positive dimension. Intrusive rumination might be regarded as this: repetitive, negative, and unwanted thoughts and memories. That's the intrusive element of it. But that's not the only kind of rumination. That's not the only way in which we can remember things and ruminate on our memories and thoughts, because there is deliberate rumination. This is repetitive, it's ruminative thoughts, purposeful thoughts focused on aspects of the struggle with the event. You can engage in deliberate rumination. So repetitive thought, purposeful thoughts focused on aspects of the struggle with the event, and you fully confront the reality and horror of what happened and continue to think about it. That's what deliberate rumination in the aftermath of trauma comes to. So a number of psychologists have held that deliberate rumination and memories about traumatic events that are part of deliberate rumination correlate with post-traumatic growth. Weirdly, some studies are starting to show that that's true of intrusive rumination as well. So both kinds of rumination can have the connection, but the connection's strongest when it comes to deliberate rumination. So just a sample quote from a study of people who were bereaved. So Taku et al. Conclude, post-traumatic growth is shown to result through deliberate ruminative thinking soon after a bereavement. Deliberate rumination soon after the event consistently has a positive impact on post-traumatic growth. Okay. So that's the positive perspective from psychology. So Tedeschi and Calhoun again, they think deliberate rumination leads to individuals to rethink repeatedly, because it's ruminative, you're repeating the memories here, about the circumstances of the traumatic event they've experienced in the hope of giving it some meaning. So the point of ruminating, the point of repeating and remembering is to give meaning to the event. So say Tedeschi and Calhoun. Okay. So in the aftermath of trauma, they think subjects, and they think there's tons of evidence for this, deliberate with two main aims. One, to understand why something happened. That's a major question they think people ask and ruminate about and think about. Why did this happen? Secondly, to discover or understand the implications of the event for their future life. So the point of deliberate rumination is precisely to understand why this happened and the implications of it for the future life. This kind of processing, so psychologists say, is associated with higher levels of post-traumatic growth. That's the view from psychology. Note that on their perspective, deliberate rumination can lead to some form of distress, given the trauma-focused nature of the rumination. So they think that the memories and the deliberate rumination is associated with emotional distress, and this can be positively correlated with post-traumatic growth. So their studies indicate. That's what they think. What I want to do now is give a kind of philosophical perspective to explain why that might be correct. Why is it the case, and actually to make a stronger claim, that negative emotion is central to this positive role? Why is it the case that deliberating in this way, why would negative emotion be so positively correlated with growth along with these dimensions? Okay, so here's a philosophical perspective on the importance of memory and negative emotion for post-traumatic growth. Here's a puzzle. And it's a puzzle it might have been generated by the shock at the high percentages of people reporting growth in the aftermath of trauma. Why does memory of and deliberation about trauma allied with emotional distress, why does this generate reports of growth? What's going on here? What's the mechanism? What's the process? How might we understand this? Two ways in which we might, I want to explain. Memories of trauma and negative emotions are central to meaning making. So if you want to make meaning, if you want to understand, then negative emotion is going to be central to that process. to understand the traumatic event. And in particular, memories of trauma and negative emotions are vital to generating social help and eliciting social support, which are important not just for recovery from trauma, but for growth as well. So there's two things that negative emotions and memories are doing here. One, to facilitate meaning making, to make meaning making more effective, and two, to elicit social support. And social support is really strongly correlated with post-traumatic growth. Okay, so let's look at these in turn. Psychologist Crystal Park, and again it's a striking statement, but she's got loads of evidence that this is true, says, meaning-making attempts and meanings made are reported by most individuals facing highly stressful events. Many studies have indicated that meaning-making attempts following highly stressful events are a near universal experience. So you experience trauma, then nearly everyone who experiences it engages in some meaning-making. They attempt to understand what happened, why it happened, and the implications for the future. That's a strikingly strong claim, but again, she's got lots of empirical backup for this. Why would this be true? Why would this happen? You might think, and this is David Rondell's view from a fabulous recent book on anxiety, it's what humans do. So Rondell says, we humans are fearful, worrying creatures. Seeking out knowledge is a natural response to being afraid. So when anxiety rises up, we instinctively go hunting for answers. So it's the nature of negative emotion that pushes us to seek to understand what happened and its implications. That's negative emotion being central to knowledge gathering and understanding. We mentioned the aphorism by Nietzsche before. Here's another nice quote from Nietzsche. It's our innate instinct of fear that ultimately bids us to know. It's because we're fearful creatures that we seek out knowledge and seek to understand. Thomas Hobbes, anxiety for the future time disposeth men to inquire into the causes of things. Anxious is problematic uncertainty, as some philosophers say. If it's problematic uncertainty, how do you stop being anxious? You find out and you try to be certain about stuff. That's a really crude idea. But it's our anxious nature that motivates us to find out. So negative emotion is at the heart of knowledge gathering and is at the heart of our search for understanding. So Thomas Reid, great Scottish philosopher, he thought that you don't really get knowledge or understanding without attention, and you don't get attention without negative emotion. So he thinks it's just any secure and stable knowledge is emotionally grounded. So that's the kind of picture you might think is applicable here as to why people engage in meaning making and why they might report growth in certain dimensions as a result of experiencing emotional distress and as a result of deliberate rumination. So here's the kind of picture. Emotions, especially negative emotions, focus our attention onto their objects and motivate reflection on the nature of the objects and the implications. We don't typically do that with positive objects. We're just happy that good things happen. We don't ruminate that much about good things. Partly because if you do, you might realise how fragile they are. Really good thing happened, you met your love of your life, but what if I wasn't in the pub that night? Oh no, I don't want to think about that. So you don't think about that because then you start getting anxious again. But the negative, the hurtful remark that someone made, or the insulting remark, or the near miss when you're driving, these occupy your attention. And you might think emotions are built to make sure they occupy your attention, so you come to understand what happened, so you can avoid the negative thing in the future. That's part of what it is. That's why it's really difficult to concentrate after a bunch of teenagers who insult you, and the rest of the day you're just thinking about it. You can't reflect on your work because you just keep your negative emotion focused on what was said. So emotions, especially negative emotions, focus our attention and motivate reflection. They do this because there's significant epistemic and practical benefits of understanding. Understanding our evaluative landscape, knowing why something was dangerous, why it's a threat, is massively important if we are to flourish. So the epistemic benefits, understanding, the practical benefits, once we understand, then we know how to deal with it. So as human beings, as creatures, it's vital that we get this kind of level of understanding, especially if terrible things have happened. Especially if terrible things, traumatic events have happened to us, therefore we know how to avoid it in the future, in particular, so we know how to respond right now. to work out the implications of this for the future. It's negative emotion which does this. In the absence of emotion and its effects on attention and memory, this process of understanding would be much less effective. And memory makes another appearance here, because when you do reflect on the meaning of the object, you do try to understand the value, then you remember similar occasions, you remember other things as well. So memory plays an iterative role here. In the absence of emotion and its effects on attention and memory, we'd be much worse at understanding. That's why you might think emotional distress is really important if you are to engage in deliberate rumination in the aftermath of trauma, and if you are to grow from that. That's one of the reasons why dissociation is really bad for us. And dissociation in the aftermath of trauma is highly correlated with post-traumatic stress disorder. Because if you dissociate, you don't focus and therefore don't come to understand the evaluative situation. You don't understand that that was dangerous and why it was dangerous. And because of that, you're hypersensitive to danger in the future. You think many more things are dangerous than are actually dangerous because you've not grasped the understanding for all kinds of perfectly legitimate reasons. But if you dissociate and you don't focus, typically you won't get the level of understanding that enables you to make progress in the future. Okay, so we need to understand our evaluative landscape and learn what's really dangerous. So that's the kind of story I think I want to tell about meaning making and the importance of emotional distress for effective meaning making. Okay, so deliberate rumination on traumatic events is likely to generate perceptions of growth along at least 3 dimensions. Those who deliberate are likely to appreciate what you still have. So in the aftermath of bereavement, you come to appreciate your family. You come to appreciate your health. You come to appreciate things precisely because you've thought about them so much. You've come to deliberate and reflect and remember. And this makes you appreciate things which you've in everyday life you can easily overlook and easily forget. That's one reason why it's not surprising that people who've experienced trauma and are able to engage in deliberate rumination report appreciation. Those who deliberate about the implications of the future are likely to see new possibilities. Again, that shouldn't be surprising. If you're working out the implications of what had happened for the future, then chances are you're going to be looking at things to do and new opportunities. The third one, the kind of spiritual and metaphysical thinking, that's a bit more difficult. But you might think if trauma is, as some people think, a kind of seismic disruption to your life, it's a transformative. I'm not sure I agree that trauma is necessarily transformative, nor that post-traumatic growth is necessarily traumative, but it can be. And what might happen is some people think all of your assumptions about the world are shattered when you undergo a traumatic experience. So you have certain assumptions about the world being a fair place and good things happening to good people, and generally people getting what they deserve. All of these assumptions, and here's the projects, and chances are I'll continue to live and be healthy, and all of that's gone, or enough of that's gone. Your assumptions about the world are shattered. In that kind of situation, you might start to look at broader frameworks. You might start to look for spiritual frameworks or broader metaphysical frameworks so you can come to understand what the world must be like now. So it's not surprising that people tend to that kind of thinking if they've undergone shattering trauma. That might explain why so many people report an increase in spiritual thinking in a post-traumatic reality. Okay, so here's the thought. Deliberate rumination motivated by emotional distress can therefore lead to perceptions of growth on a number of dimensions. Okay, that's meaning making. What about social support? So the meaning-making model won't really explain, I think, or won't explain well, can't easily account for improvements in relationships, nor in greater strength. So I'm going to ignore greater strength, but I want to show how memory and negative emotion are vital for growth in personal relationships through the seeking of social support. And again, emotion will be central to this, and memory will be central to this. Okay. Here's something that almost everyone agrees upon in the literature. Social support before, during and after trauma is massively valuable. Positive related to recovery and to the prevention of post-traumatic stress disorder and to post-traumatic growth. So everyone pretty much agrees that social support is extremely valuable. And you have different kinds of social support. There's emotional support, informational support, and there's instrumental support. Emotional support that can help a traumatized person express or talk about their feelings, their emotions in a kind of safe space. So that's the kind of emotional support. And it can be constituted by others giving the right kind of emotional response. being compassionate, being empathetic. So two kinds of emotional support in a kind of dialogic process. You're allowed as a traumatized person to express your emotions, to talk about them, and you get positive emotional support from other people. That's highly valuable. Informational support enables the traumatized person share information about what's going on, what's happened to them, again in a kind of safe space, and to let other people know. But equally, it can consist in the giving of advice and guidance to the traumatized person. Telling them, here's one, given that's happened, here's how you might think about the event, here's what you need to do, here's a good piece of advice for dealing with. All kinds of important informational support in a dialogic process as well. And instrumental support or pragmatic support covers a wide range of practical care and assistance. Of particular importance, especially for children, is the provision of safety. If you don't recover, you don't become resilient, and you certainly don't grow unless you are in a safe and secure environment. Okay, so different levels of support. You might think two things. One, accurate memories are really important for the provision of the right kind of support. Because no, it's not just the availability of support, and lots of people report if support's available, then it's actually unhelpful if it's the wrong kind of support, or if you're in the presence of bad actors, or if you're in the presence of people who just interfere, or if you're in the presence of people who just simply don't know what they're talking about, or they've misunderstood what's going on. So the mere availability of support, you might think, is a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition for you getting the right kind of support. And you might think accurate memories will be vital for eliciting the right kind of support here. For kind of obvious reasons. So the quality of support you get along all three dimensions is likely to vary upon an accurate assessment on the part of the person providing the support as to what happened. You need to be able to accurately assess what happened to someone else in order to provide the right kind of support, in order to give the right kind of advice. Likewise with practical help. Understanding on the part of those providing the support of the meaning and implications of the event on the traumatized person's beliefs, goals, etc. You have to know what the event was, why it happened, what it meant to the person, the effects on their goals, beliefs, future prospects, in order to be in a position to give good advice. You better know the right kind of emotions to respond to, when you need to give people room and when you need to engage with them closely, and so on and so forth. You might think accurate memories and the conveyance of accurate memories will be vital to this kind of support. So that's the memory element of it. Why negative emotion? Why would negative emotion be part of this picture? Why would the emotional distress that's generated by memories of trauma be so important to generating this kind of social support? The answer is that emotions are communicative devices. That's one of the things, at least, they do. Emotions capture and focus attention, they motivate reflection, they help you to understand, but also they communicate. And if you've, from Darwin onwards, people have thought that's why we're emotional creatures. So we convey facially, in our bodily expression, vocally, our emotions, and this has all kinds of positive social effects. So it's the communicative function of emotion, in particular of emotional distress, that can, not necessarily will, but can be important in eliciting the right kind of social support. So, theorists of emotion agree that emotions can serve social goals. They can do all kinds of things, emotions. And one of the things they can do is serve social goals through their communicative functions and via communicative processes, in particular through facial, verbal, and bodily expression. Simple one is embarrassment facilitates forgiveness. If you're embarrassed in the presence of colleagues, they're much more likely to forgive you for your transgression and bring you back into the social fold, which is a good thing for you. If you're not embarrassed at all, if you're shameless, chances are you won't be forgiven as easily. So you might think feelings of embarrassment and displays of embarrassment, blushing, lowered eyes, smaller bodily expression, facilitates you being brought back into the group, which is a really good thing. You might think other emotions, jealousy plays the same kind of role, anger plays the same kind of role. They communicate all kinds of things. Anger communicates you've transgressed, and I'm not happy about you transgressing, and you better do something about it because I'm displaying anger. So all this is the basic picture. So anyway, so emotions have important communicative value, communicative processes through facial, verbal, and bodily expressions, and therefore they can provide and elicit information. That's one of the things that emotions do for us. They hold that facial, vocal and verbal expressions of emotion can function to convey information to others about the senders and help to facilitate and coordinate social interactions. That's one of the reasons why we display our emotions. Not intentionally, that's just how our emotional bodies work. And emotions serve to elicit emotions in others. They have evocative functions. So emotions serve to elicit functions, they have evocative functions. So they can evoke complementary emotions. These differ from the original emotion, but motivate important social behaviour. So distress can motivate, can elicit sympathy and compassion from other people. If you've ever seen someone walking down the street and they're crying, then the initial natural response is to feel empathy or sympathy, or at least feel bad for the person, because that's an emotional response. When we go to the cinema and you know it's an amusing film and people laughing together, we tend to laugh more. Again, that's a kind of emotional contagion. So emotions can elicit complementary emotions. They can also elicit similar emotions. So sadness and distress can elicit sadness and distress. So from Keltner and Kring, children respond to signs of distress, concern and overt attempts to help in response to others' distress, beginning at as early as 8 months. So we're good at it, and we're good at it early. You recognise the distress in others and you try and help at 8 months. Okay, so that's the evocative function as well. So here's why emotional distress can function. So it can function to generate the kind of emotional, informational and instrumental support that's needed for a person to recover from trauma. It's not always going to do this, but it's unlikely that you get these social benefits without the displays of emotional distress. Expressions of intense fear, shock and horror can signal and provide information about the traumatised person's state to others. That's one of the things that communication is trauma. And you know what a horrified face looks like. You know what a terrified face looks like. We've developed to recognise these things. So it has a communicative function, and we're good at picking up on the cues. Okay. And emotional distress can also have an evocative function. Traumatic emotions can evoke complementary emotions, such as empathy and compassion. But they can also so complementary also that can evoke similar emotions as well. So the distress and signs of distress and concern. Okay. So emotions have communicative aspects and value as well as the kind of informative aspects and value. Okay. If so, here's why emotional distress and negative emotion can explain the high numbers of people reporting post-traumatic growth on relationships dimensions. For it's highly likely that traumatized subjects who receive the right kind of social support as a result of accurate memory, as a result of engaging and communicating emotional distress, will experience improvements in their relationship, or at least will report improvements in their relationship. So, perception of being able to count on people because people were there to help. So this is why people report it. You've experienced people being around to help because you've expressed and communicated your emotions. A greater willingness to express emotions because empathetic other people facilitate this. A greater sense of closeness to others as a result of emotional support generating positive feelings. A greater compassion for others as a result of the care and attention and compassion that you've received. And learning about how wonderful people can be when you are in the very depths of despair. That's what you learn if you express and communicate. Okay, so that's how you might think accurate memory and emotional distress that's generated by accurate memory can help facilitate social support, which helps to explain perceptions of growth after trauma. So it's not just cognitive benefits like understanding, meaning making, it also facilitates social support. Okay, so to conclude, so I'm just kind of on time. Memorials to and memories of trauma can have complex relations with value. That's something we've hopefully seen. And often memories of trauma, especially when intrusive, are harmful and indeed criterial for disorders such as PTSD. So nothing I've said is undermining that. Nothing I've said here is to dismiss that. PTSD is a terrible, terrible disorder, and intrusive memories are criterial for it. Okay. Nevertheless, some negative emotions generated by memories of trauma are central to the positive value that memorials to trauma can have. And partly this is because of deliberate rumination, but also intrusive rumination people are increasingly think can have these benefits as well. So deliberate rumination about trauma with memories and emotional distress at its heart. So you don't get the benefits without the emotional distress. Is generative of post-traumatic growth. So a capacity to remember and feel distress in the aftermath of trauma, this can be, I think, if this is correct, and if we can get over the other skeptical worries about the nature of post-traumatic growth, these can be a source of hope rather than simply despair for people who've undergone the very worst kinds of experiences. Okay, thank you.
Hi, great. Thanks for that. It was amazing. Is trauma genetic, like unresolved trauma? Can you adopt it from your parents or give it to your children?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the reasons why I mainly focus on acute trauma or single instance trauma, even though a lot of trauma is chronic, a lot of trauma is repeated, a lot of trauma is collective, is because it's difficult enough, but it avoids certain controversial questions. And one is precisely about whether trauma can be passed on genetically. In one sense, if genetic inheritance can constitute emotional injury, if because of what you inherit genetically, that means that you struggle to understand the evaluative world, you struggle to relate to other people, you struggle to act appropriately, then if it could be shown that those emotional problems are a result of inheritance, then you might think that trauma can be passed on. But yeah, I don't really know much about memory and forgetting. I know very little about genetic inheritance. But it's a really good question because some people think of trauma in that way. They think historical trauma is just genetic inheritance.
Well, you can carry it in the body as well, can't you?
Yeah.
It's carried in the body and then that's transformed genetically.
Yeah. And so that would be the interesting question. And so on my account, I think if that has the negative effects that I think are constitutive of trauma, if it generates the kind of helplessness and feelings of inability to control and all of the other negative effects, then why not call that historical inherited trauma? Yeah, but it's a really good question.
Thank you. You mentioned the book The Body Keeps the Score, and I've been looking into somatic experiencing and how there's a correlation between trauma and nervous system malfunction. And some doctor, like Daniel Amen, also can scan the brain and see that the brain functions a bit differently in post-traumatic stress disorder. I was wondering, what are your thoughts and what have you found in your research with the relationship between people who experience post-traumatic growth and how their nervous system function and how they get their nervous system back into more balanced?
That's a really good question. I'm going to give a really kind of rubbish answer. It's kind of tricky enough to keep on top of the psychological literature such that I can. I don't have the kind of knowledge or the ability as a philosopher to engage in those kinds of answers or to investigate that thing. I'm simply not qualified or competent to do anything. It'd be really interesting to look into the neuroscientific evidence of the changes that people report. And of course, it's always tricky as to what we're measuring when we do brain scans and so all of that's massively controversial and really, really tricky. And it would be really interesting in cases of longer term growth. And one of the issues about post-traumatic growth is, what's the timescale? Is it a couple of months after bereavement you feel that your relationships are better, that you're seeing new opportunities? 5 years later? If you're not feeling that anymore, did you grow? So all of those are really interesting. So timescale ones are really, really controversial and difficult. But yeah, I think that the neurophysiological evidence of growth, I would have to ask some of my smarter psychologist pals and say what they say. So yeah, it's a good question. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that.
Thank you.
Earlier, you mentioned that most of the studies looking at PTG were done through self-report measures. Have there been any attempts since the early 2000s to move on to new methodologies?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think the difficulty with kind of longitudinal studies is it's trauma. So it's difficult to predict as and when. There have been more studies with people who have highly susceptible to cancer diagnosis. So you can, so if you're in a family with high incidence of cancer, then they might study early on before any cancer diagnosis and then post diagnosis. So they are doing those studies, and that's the kind of methodology you want to do. But for obvious reasons, with other traumas, I mean, combat injury, you might think that would be something that would be predictable, at least if you're going to do a longitudinal study there. But most of them have still been self-reports with all the difficulties that self-reports generate. I mean, there's all kinds of biases. And one of the things I didn't mention, but another reason for skepticism is, it depends on the kind of cultural narrative that's important. If you're in a culture where the narrative is heroism and overcome adversity and all of that kind of thing, and someone says, "Have you grown?" You're like, "Yeah." If you're in a culture where that's not so much of a cultural narrative, you might say no. If you're asked about all the ways in which you've grown, you'd probably pick out some positive ones. But if you're asked about all the ways in which your life's absolutely terrible now, you might emphasize the negative. So all kinds of reasons to be suspicious about self-report. But yeah, the gold standard would be a really long-term, longitudinal study.
I wanted to ask about your personal views on whether you think the term trauma is being overused nowadays, in terms of where do you draw the line, on what you classify as a traumatic event, besides just the criteria on the DSM. And there's also this thing of older people say that back in our day, people were a lot more resilient than they are nowadays. And so how much truth do you think there is to that?
Oh, that's two really great questions. Okay, take them in order. It's really tricky talking about concept creep and the expansion of the use of trauma, because partly when you want to say we want to reserve trauma for particularly damaging events, it sounds as if you're kind of being dismissive of everything else, and there you're not taking the great suffering that people can go through seriously enough. But I think one ought to take that seriously, whilst at the same time saying there are ways in which you might think suffering and negative experience is just part and parcel of life. And in a way, it's part of a kind of normative growth. And you might think in that, if it doesn't have grieving, so my mother died 91 last September, and I grieved, I'm still grieving. I don't think I was traumatized by that, even though it's a really, really sad occasion. I'm still thinking of her. But I wasn't traumatized, so I don't think I was injured. It wasn't incomprehensible. She was 91, good life and everything like that. So it didn't have the kinds of effects on my comprehension or on my ability to relate to others. So me and my sisters became closer as a result of this, So it didn't have the kind of negative effects that I think represent emotional injury. So that would be because grief happens, and especially, we'll experience in it, and 91-year-old parent, fine. Not fine, but better than a 9-year-old child. Now, I think that death is highly likely to be traumatic, and yeah. So I think it's kind of difficult, because I think some elements of suffering and negative experience are part and parcel of life. Others clearly aren't, and especially when they cause that kind of injury. And I also think that people who subjects of collective and historical trauma, to refer to that term, as a matter of fairness to people who've, we looked at the Holocaust Memorial before. Keeping trauma for events of that kind, for instance, you might think that's to represent the seriousness of what went on. Brexit's not of that kind, you might think, and therefore you might think a continuum of value, but you might think some are so different from this value is so different from other ones that you ought not to perhaps be using the same term. But I ought not to be using the term ought here, because that sounds overly prescriptive as well. I do think there can be, final thing I'll say on this, there can be ways in which people can be genuinely traumatized about things that other people might think as trivial. So, suppose that you are the kind of person that spends £10 million on a Ferrari, right? And you've got a classic car collection. And it's destroyed in a fire. I imagine it's psychologically possible that someone could be massively traumatized by that. They can't understand how it happened. It's their life project. All of the traumatic effects go on. So I want to say that even though people think luxury car collection, not that big a deal, but for that person, I think they can be traumatized. Here's what I want to say as an addendum to that is, you ought not to be traumatized by certain things because you ought not to have certain projects and goals. It's like someone grieving terribly over the death of a murderous dictator. In one sense, you could say it's genuine grief where the beloved dictator died, but you ought not to be grieving about that person. Why? Because they were a dictator. So I think you can make those kind of moves to acknowledge genuine traumas with respect to damaging projects. So I think that's a possibility there. So what was the second question again? Sorry.
I was asking, like, do you think there's some truth to the fact that, like, the statement that, like, a lot of older people make in terms of saying that, like, their generation had more resilience than the current one?
Yeah, it's really, well, you think, what the current one has to go through, the current generation has to go through, and that involves a lot of things that people of my age didn't go through. Because we had, 3 TV channels and no social media and none of the pressures, and your comparison class was tiny. Your comparison class, if you're reasonably okay in your school and reasonably bright, then that's you think I'm bright. Why? Because my comparison class is the other 25 people in Manchester that I'm in school with. Now your comparison class is worldwide, and of course you're going to have many more problems if that's who you're comparing with yourself with all the time. So that's something this generation has to go through that we didn't, and my generation didn't have to go through. And there's all kinds of things like that. The fact that it's easier for me to buy a flat than it will be for you to buy a flat, and lots of other people in this room to buy a flat, because I bought a flat because I'm really old. And it was easier when I bought a flat, that kind of thing. So yeah, so I think it's the kind of thing people say, and I think it's probably likely to be false. I think this generation has got an awful lot to put up with and puts up with it remarkably well. And we graduate the students at Glasgow every year, and just remarkable students, and really proud of them to get through that. Yeah, so that's the answer.
Thank you for that. I thought that was really interesting. My question is about the harm-based, sort of the theoretical views of harm. And say someone experiences a traumatic event, undergoes PTG, and then says their life is better off than it was beforehand. Would you say that the traumatic event harmed that individual?
Really good question. I think one of the difficult philosophical questions about how we define growth is whether you mean along one dimension or all things considered. So it could well be the case, and this is, some people report this. I can't remember the rabbi's second name, but reported death of a son, and said, in many ways, it's made me a much better religious teacher, and has made me much more virtuous in so many other ways, and I give all of that up for a second to help us on back. So in one sense, you've got growth, you've got ways in which they become, they're much more virtuous, and yet the loss of the son just devastated them and made them much worse off. So that's to say that you could have growth on some dimensions, but it's not post-traumatic growth, because growth has to be all things considered. I tend to think that what will happen is I tend to think that the dimensions of growth cluster, so that if you get more social support, you'll be inclined to get more understanding, and you'll be inclined to be able to act better. So I think growth along one dimension will tend to bring with it growth along other dimensions. So if you do have genuine growth, it's more likely to be growth, all things considered, but it's not guaranteed, as those kinds of cases show. So in the case of someone who says, it's absolutely terrible what happened, but my relationships are much better now, you might think they were harmed. If all things considered, they're worse off and would kind of swap. But it needn't be that way. Some people can say, and people do say, best thing to ever happen to me. The cancer diagnosis, best thing that's ever happened to me. I'm a much better person now. So yeah, there will be lots of different cases. It's a really good question as to all things considered versus one dimension. Virtue theory has the same problem. Can you be courageous in one respect and a terrible person in lots of others? Really courageous assassin. And some people think you can be. You can be virtuous on that dimension. Other people think, no, the virtues cluster. So in order to be genuinely courageous, you have to be compassionate and just and things like that. But yeah.
Hello, and thank you for the talk. I just want to ask how we can increase the growth after these or such trauma. What are the factors can increase the growth rather than the harm?
What is it? What factors can help people grow after trauma?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Well, I think social support is one of them that's regarded as really important. That kind of safety, security, having the right kind of people around you is massively important. I think self-efficacy is one of them. If you've built up a certain level of confidence in your abilities to put up with negative feelings and overcome them and overcome obstacles, then people who report higher self-efficacy typically report better ability to cope with what's happened and better growth there. If you get too high on the self-efficacy, you rarely report growth because you're doing pretty well on all the kind of dimensions of strength, for instance. So there's various internal factors like self-efficacy, confidence, knowledge base. You have a reasonably good understanding of value. You have a reasonably good understanding of what would be an effective response and what wouldn't be an effective response. All that kind of cognitive base as well. So there will be a whole range of factors and personality factors. People think that if you're optimistic, you tend to do better. That's not that surprising. If you're optimistic, you'll look for new opportunities. If you're pessimistic, you might not see any. I think extroverts tend to do better. I'm not sure about narcissists. I think that the jury might be out on whether narcissists do better. But there's certain personality traits that are more correlated with reports of growth than other ones. So internal factors and external factors as well. It's a very good question.
Hey, thanks so much for the lecture. I just wanted to ask, from your perspective as a philosopher, you showed some photographs at the beginning of the lecture, and I just wondered whether you had any thoughts or ideas about the nature of photography in relation to trauma and post-traumatic growth.
I don't. Again, a simple answer, and it's kind of like the very unsatisfying answer. I think I would like to do more work and more investigation in it. There's interesting, I think in The Body Keeps the Scorebook, about kind of medical humanities approaches and ways in which theatre might help people recover and yoga might help people. Photography, I don't, and it would be really interesting for me to find out more about that. I mean, do you have? Yeah,
I'm doing some research on it, but I was just wondering from your perspective as a philosopher if there were kind of any thoughts that just came up from that.
I can't really, because I don't really do philosophy of art or photography. I know, and I'm remarkably ignorant on loads of things, so I can't. Sorry, I know that's really unsatisfying, but it's I guess it's honest.
Thanks for the great talk. I'm interested about whether you think there's a metaphysics of the self that's kind of implied by the accounts that you're giving. So I can see how this could work with a kind of substantive theory of the self, where you've got this point that you can grow from. I think perhaps it could work with a kind of like process-based self, but I'm not really sure how that would work. But I also wonder, like, do you need to care? Like, can you be agnostic about those sort of issues?
Yeah, I'm going to say I can be agnostic because that's the easier answer for me. And I don't have a view about the self here. I think it would be. I think I've got my work cut out if I want to try and give an account of what post-traumatic growth could be that's respectful of what the psychologists have said. So it can't be too revisionary. It can't be. I can't say here's what post-traumatic growth is, and all the psychologists say, well, what you're talking about. That's not what we study. And then see how it might be, how philosophical thinking about the nature of growth and trauma might help explain the connections between the two. I think virtues are pretty substantive character traits, and I think the general account might well be that growth is a kind of movement towards virtue, and that implies a particular view of the self. And I think virtues can be understood in terms of particular kinds of personality traits. So I think I have those kind of commitments, but nothing metaphysically deeper than that. Apart from I think virtues are real, and I think character traits are real, and they're not necessarily we're not so situationally dependent. But apart from that, not really. So hopefully I can be agnostic. If I get in trouble, then it'd be really interesting to know. Then I might have to do some fancy footwork.
Okay, thank you.
Really fascinating. I am interested in the subconscious, conscience, and temporality relationship. And I liked what you had to say about trauma as an emotional injury, and I think of grieving as sort of bleeding. And if you don't, wipe up the blood, you're gonna keep bleeding. And I had a lot of trauma, abrupt young death in my youth, and I ran away from it. And I have epilepsy, and when I went home in my adult life, my seizures increased from not having any tonic-clonic to having 2 a month. And so my question is about memory, because thinking about time, every time we remember something, we're remembering it in this moment. So it's different than the last time we remembered it. And I'm fascinated by how that works in our conscious ability to remember something, but also how our subconscious is remembering these tragic or traumatic things we experienced. So it's kind of this trifecta. I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. I've not got much to say about subconscious memory or how memory works, because I'm not a kind of memory scholar or memory researcher. But I think what you say is really interesting about how memory develops in time, and what I do think is really interesting, how memory over time has different emotional effects and what should happen to that. Because you might think, okay, here's one thing you might think is a little bit puzzling. If memory of a tragic death generated, if a tragic death generated such vehement emotions at one age, and the memory 10 years later is a memory of something which was a genuine tragedy, then you might think there's no real reason why you ought not to be feeling the same kind of emotions then, because you might think it's a recognition of the terror and horror of what happened should generate the same kind of emotions. But typically that doesn't happen. Typically our emotions recede over time. And then it's a kind of philosophical puzzle, because you might think, well, if emotion's supposed to tell us what's valuable and what's disvaluable, and yet we can remember something that was truly tragic, and our emotional effect is dampened and we're not feeling what we felt at the time, then what does that tell us about the relationship between the value of the event or the disvalue of the event and our reaction to it? So in one sense, we ought to think, and it's a good job that memories don't generate the same kind of negative emotion. But in another sense, that's a bit puzzling and problematic, because you think they ought to. So every time you think about the loss of a loved one, you ought to be grieving, in one sense, at the same intensity. So yeah, that's I do think emotion and memory over time has that weird paradoxical relationship. In one sense it should do, in another sense why should it diminish if the loss hasn't diminished? But yeah, sorry, I was rambling.
No, that's great, and it gives me things to think about. Thank you so much.
Hello, once again, thank you for a wonderful talk. Just a question on the memories, because you talk about the memories, the live memories, as you say, and the personal growth, PTG. But how about the suppressed memories? Does that mean, you mentioned something about dissociation? Would that fall into that category? So if you suppressed or like memory loss, because in a lot of trauma, the mind just can't cope and you wipe out all the memories, would you say would prevent to gain the growth?
I think from what I know about it, that I mean the process, as far as I understand it, how it usually works, there's an intense period of kind of intrusion and dissociation in the immediate aftermath of trauma, because partly it's because you can't process the enormity of what's happened. If it's something that completely, if not completely, shatters some of your core projects and your core beliefs and your core relationships, then how do you process that? And so what happens is dissociate, but then there's intrusive memories, and then you start to process, and then there's a kind of back and forth between dissociation and intrusion. And at some point, in those who don't develop PTSD, you come to a recognition of the reality of what happened, and you can then start to deliberate and think and reflect about meaning, and then you can engage with the kind of meaning making. If you don't get to that point, if you're constantly dissociating or moving between dissociation and intrusion, or if you can't access a memory because they're just not accessible to memory, then you won't get to that point of deliberate rumination. Therefore, you won't get to growth. So I do think that's the problem with repressed memories. I think at some stage, I think part of the therapy would be at some stage you have to confront the reality and the awfulness if you are to integrate the memory, and you need to integrate the memory if you are to make progress, to recover, and then possibly to grow. So that's as far as I'm aware of it, but it's a really interesting question about what happens with memories that we can't integrate and bad things. I think that's
Thank you.
what it says. Thank you.
Right. I'm just wondering, if most of the growth is self-reported, how do you differentiate between growth and people sort of desperately looking for silver linings?
That's a really good question. Yes, spot on. And that's one of the reasons people are skeptical here, because you might be inclined to say, the reports are ways of coping. They're ways of making it. You reappraise what happened. So it wasn't. So if I was sort of violently assaulted, I might initially think, how could that happen? The world's unfair. People are violent, and then I might reappraise the action as well. It's just someone lashing out because they're in a really bad situation, and then I should try and understand them, and that's trying to cope with the enormity of what's happened. I think one of the important things to do, and this relates to the question about longitudinal measures, is you look for more things than self-report. So you have diary work by family members or people who are close friends. So it could well be the case that you think your relationships are better after this because you've worked through and you've got the social support you need, and your family and friends are reporting, you know what, that doesn't seem to reflect how we understand the reality. It doesn't reflect the behaviour and doesn't reflect how you're engaging with other people. So that would be one way in which, of course, you need multiple perspectives here. But if you do get confirmatory evidence from family and friends and people who know each other better over a period of time, then it's much more likely that they've. So yeah, it would be kind of diary reports from other people, regular reports about how often you're thinking about the event, how often you did something that you thought was a compassionate or empathetic thing compared to how, so it's tricky, but I think you get other people involved, and that would be a measure of reporting that might help to undermine some of the skepticism. But it's really difficult. I mean, in one sense, this is saying, look, here's what growth is going to look like if there is such a thing. And at this point, psychologists might just say, well, if we can't measure it, if you can't get some really, really solid methodological frameworks in place to measure it, then maybe there's growth, maybe not. So that's the kind of core of skepticism there. But psychologists are increasingly positive, I think, that they can do it, but it's just massively complicated and expensive and difficult to do. But that would be the kind of thing. So yeah, really nice question.
Thank you.
Quite a few times when you reference the memories, the word accurate, and you actually highlighted that accurate memories. That's really tricky. Accurate to who? And a characteristic of trauma is that people don't remember things accurately. And, even rape victims, when they reflect back on the circumstances and they'll say this happened, and then the evidence will come, no, that didn't happen at all. So accuracy to who?
Yeah, no, I think I've not got anything particularly deep to say about that, apart from the fact that if one wants to elicit the kind of support one needs for a particular event, then in broad terms, the event will have to be conveyed to others and communicated in a way that you get help for that kind of event. So just so that people don't reappraise what happened, and they might reappraise what happened. Actually, it wasn't that kind of injury. It wasn't that kind of event because they can't work out whether what's being conveyed or communicated.
It seems it's linked to growth, though. If it's not an accurate memory, the growth, all those studies. So how were they proving that link? Because you kept saying accurate growth was a condition to accurate memories was a condition to the growth.
Yeah, I would think that accurate memory is much more likely to generate the kind of social support you need to grow.
But so the studies were proving those were the links. It was accurate memories, and inaccurate memories then have a different and don't have growth.
No. But it would be the kind of thing that would be more likely to. Just so here's something. So if you have friends and family who are good at giving advice, that's more likely to be positively associated to recovery and growth than you having friends and family who are interfering and really don't know what they're talking about. But in that sense, you might think there's a positive correlation here. I think it falls well short of proof. But you might think the more accurate the memory is, the more likely you are to get the kind of informational support in particular and the kind of instrumental support you need. But it's a good question precisely because memories are many times unreliable and difficult to say what was accurate in that situation or not. But yeah, it's broad brushstrokes, but yeah.
Hi, thank you. There was a part in there when you talked about the quality of support depends on the accuracy of assessment by the person providing support. This is something I struggle with on a day-to-day basis, and it's been triggered by what other people have asked. Is that not all down to the person providing support? It basically comes down to perception, and kind of the way that I perceive an event to have happened to you may not seem traumatic, but it's not just in that, even in the level of what I think is the most, who provides the metric in terms of like what's the right way to treat something, because you don't really know what you're giving advice to because you haven't perceived the event or anything in that person's own being in a way. Like we all perceive things differently and we'll never know how someone else actually feels without to an accurate point of view, if that makes sense. Like,
good. That's a really good point. It depends what we mean by accuracy here and how. If you're quite right, we can't literally perceive what they perceive. We can't literally experience what they did. But you might think there are ways in which we might improve our knowledge of what the situation was. Testimony is one of them. I mean, the testimony is we rely for testimony for very, very many things. The majority of things we know we have to rely on the testimony of others, and we generally tend to think that people are reliable testifiers. You know, if you ask someone the time, then they say it's 8:10, and unless you're really, really cynical, you just say, oh, it's 8:10. Because we have a kind of habit-forming thing. So I think in these cases, you would try and rely on testimony, rely on behaviour, ask them what happened in a kind of safe space, and then ask advice from other people. So there's all kinds of ways in which you might think you might improve the accuracy or the perhaps validity of the advice you're giving, based on what they're saying, based on your knowledge, and based on what other people are saying. And you might think that's why wisdom is a virtue. Wisdom is the virtue that enables you to give good advice. And it's really difficult to be wise because you need to get all kinds of information from all kinds of sources, and it has to be the kind of information that makes a coherent sense and would be helpful to the person in their circumstances. To get to that level, you have to need all kinds of skills. So I think the point would be to be a really good advisor, a really good person who can give advice. You have to have elements of wisdom. And so that's why you might think the wise person has a more accurate take on the world than the person who's less wise. So the more you approach the virtues of wisdom, the better you might be at that task, even though you're quite right. You don't, even as the wise person, literally perceive what they perceived or experience or undergo what they went through. So that would be roughly in the direction I want to go here.
I think you may have already sort of spoken about this, but I'm curious between the connection between storytelling and in the post-trauma time, how much does storytelling to yourself and while you're recalling the events to someone else has the power to, change the emotion and the memory of the situation?
Oh, massively. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think sort of narrative approaches to growth and narrative approaches and explanations of why people growth are really interesting and increasingly common. If you can tell a story as to how you've overcome that and you suddenly become the hero of the story. That's positively associated with growth, in particular growth in strength. So it's talking about what happened and making narrative sense. And that you might think is just part of what meaning making is. So meaning making in a really restricted sense would be what happened. And then, so what actually happened? Then in a broader sense, why did it happen? So you understand maybe the reasons why something happened. How do I go on? And then what kind of story can I tell about myself that would allow me to go on in a way that facilitates growth? So you might think these are all part of a very rich narrative of meaning making, and making narrative sense is part of the overall meaning and understanding. Because we are creatures with narratives. And we do understand ourselves and the world in terms of these narratives. So yeah, there's lots of really interesting stuff on narrative approaches to growth. And some people think that's the main mechanism. I'm not sure I want to go that far, but it's certainly a really interesting way in which we can come to meaning and understanding.
Hi, this is a very interesting evening for me. And I wondered actually, what is the role of journaling in terms of, we hear about the accuracy of memories and probably reflections and information and support. What are your thoughts on that in terms of looking at it in the perspective of trauma? And the second one, I'm curious when your next book is coming out.
Right, okay, so the second question is easier, but I'll the first one. Well, actually, maybe it's not. It's a bit vague. First question is a really good one. I imagine if journaling is both important for narrative purposes, making sense of what happened, or just trying to get down and reflect and ruminate on what happened, you might think journaling all the time is part of that process of deliberate rumination. So that would I think how journaling would tie into some of the things I wanted to say there about the ways in which memory, negative emotion can be related to growth. In terms of the book, I'll send it off in summer and see what happens. So hopefully, if it comes out, it'll come out somewhere. But whether it comes out in the place I want it to come out in, that's the important one. But hopefully, yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, I suppose we've got 2 minutes left. I'll ask a quick question. Can you experience something akin to PTSD from experiences that are nice? So something that's just too exciting or too pleasant, you just can't process it at all.
Yeah. So there's a before this I had a project, the Value of Suffering project, and before that there was a pain project. So I don't know why, I think I'm a generally happy person, but work on all these really negative things. And there's a view of pain which says that pain is a kind of disruption of agential functioning. That's just what pain is. And then people will respond, just say, well, extreme pleasure disrupts functioning. So and since you think pain and pleasure are very, very different things, it can't just be the disruption of functioning there. I take it with the extreme pleasures, whether it would have the four elements of negative appraisal, extreme feelings that I would think would be part of it. Certainly, one can lose control and be helpless. Certainly, there can be long-term negative effects there. I just wonder whether there would be, if it's not chronic, if it's not a chronic condition, if it's just bliss in the moment, then you might not have the negative appraisal and the negative feelings there. But certainly, you would have the sense of helplessness. And that would be, I'm not sure that would be enough for emotional injury, but it's a really nice question. And it puts pressure on certain views of pain that yeah.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your questions, and thank you, Michael, for a very engaging talk.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Thank you.